welcome to the CEPR EBRD Economics of Transition and Institutional Change webinar series on economics of industrial policy. My name is Beata Javorcik. I'm the chief economist of EBRD, and it's our pleasure to be one of the hosting institutions of this seminar series. EBRD publishes every year a publication called Transition Report, and our next report will have the title, The State Strikes Back. The title is becoming more timely by the minute, but it explains our interest in industrial policy. And actually, we were planning to run a symposium on this topic. Unfortunately, the pandemic came in the way. So instead, we have opted for a webinar series. So for the next 6 weeks, we will be meeting on every Tuesday at 3 p.m. London time to listen to papers about industrial policy. We are very grateful to CEPR for co-hosting this webinar with us, and of course, to our speakers who have agreed to take part. So it's my pleasure to introduce Noam Yucthman from the London School of Economics, who will be the first speaker in our series, and he will talk about data-intensive innovation and the state, and he will present some evidence from AI firms in China. So Noam, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for showing up. This is the first time I've done this, so I hope I can remain engaged and funny and interesting without seeing your faces. And I will, apologize or maybe say you're welcome in advance if my 2-year-old interrupts. We shall see. So this is joint work with Martin Baraha at MIT, David Yang at Harvard. And I want to add sort of a special thanks on this title slide to our RAs. You'll see there was a pretty monumental data collection exercise and also machine learning exercise that was conducted to make this research possible. And needless to say, that was not me. It also wasn't Martin and David. It was this great team of RAs that we had, Haoran Shuhao, Shangqi, Wenwei, and Guoli. So we owe them a lot. So the background here is I think something that we all have some sense of, at least, that AI technology is sort of a broad set of arguably general purpose technologies at the frontier that have a potential to be truly transformative in a way that goes beyond many technical changes in the sense of being incredibly broad, affecting a range of different occupations, affecting growth trajectories, affecting essentially every type of business. So thinking about the replacement of humans with machines, but not only for manual tasks but also for cognitive ones, and so the scope of that is truly of great potential, changing economies, societies, politics, potentially. What is maybe a little bit less understood than the potential sort of transformative power of AI is what makes AI special as a type of innovation. And one of the things that you learn very quickly when you read about modern AI research, especially since the deep learning revolution that's really transformed artificial intelligence in the past, not even 10 years, is how data intensive AI innovation is. So we think about great coding often, and we think about advances in computation often coming from writing really good algorithms. And we might think, okay, what should be hard about AI is teaching computers how to think. How do we program thinking? And it turns out, I won't go into the history of AI research. It's a fascinating area of the history of science, in fact. But just to say, the recent deep learning advances are not about new algorithms for the most part. They're about having access to a ton of data and being able to process a ton of data. So there are also technological changes, hardware changes that you need, but access to data is crucial to advances in AI in recent years, and this is true in areas from facial recognition, speech recognition, to things like teaching computers how to play games really well. These advances weren't developed in recent years on the back of a new algorithm, but old algorithms applied to large data sets. So in the way we think about AI innovation is being data-intensive innovation. And so the research question in this paper, and it's a big paper, as you'll see. I'll talk about each component of it in some detail. I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about some parts that I gloss over. But we ask a big question, which is what drives the direction of innovation and overall growth rate in a data-intensive economy. And we're going to study one component of that question, which is related to the role of the state. And we highlight two characteristics of data that contribute to a particular economics and political economy of innovation and growth in data-intensive economies. First, we highlight the fact that states play a key role in collecting and holding data. So, one of my favorite quotes from a great economist that was shared with me. So Raul Sanchez de la Sierra shared with me this sort of idea that the word state is at the root of the word statistics. That data collection is at the heart of what states do. And Scott sort of famously wrote in his book, Seem Like a State, about the need of states to make their societies legible. And they do that by organizing information and collecting that information. That continues until today at kind of a remarkable depth and breadth. States collect a ton of data about us and about the societies that they help to organize. And that makes them key players in any sort of data intensive innovation. So, in the case of facial recognition, which is going to be our focus here, you can really think about, surveillance as a key objective of the state. So surveillance has a slightly negative connotation, but let's say public security as slightly more neutral. The state wants to produce public security. One way it does that is by monitoring people in space. And the monitoring of people in space using cameras generates enormous amounts of data about people and space. And that data can be an input into state goods, essentially the production of security, but potentially other goods, as we'll talk about. In addition to collecting data to produce state goods like security, the state shapes the price and quantity of data available in different ways, whether it's regulations governing the collection of data, property rights over data. Think about data protection laws in Europe, for example, that limit data collection. And a range of other potential applications of data where the state plays a key role. Part two is, states collect data, and states might hold data for the production of government goods. But in addition, data are non-rival data are non-rival inputs in the innovation process, and that's true across a few different margins. So one margin that people have talked about and I think has received some attention is the non-rivalry of data across firms. So if one firm uses data, that doesn't affect the ability of another firm to use data, and that has economic implications. Another margin along which data is a non-rival input is non-rival in uses. And so what that means is that the use of government data to produce a government good, like public security, using that data for one purpose doesn't diminish its value in other purposes. For example, producing a better retail facial scanning product. So what we do in the paper is formalize these two dimensions of data that we think are particularly important. One, an important role for the state in collecting data and holding it, and two, the non-rival use of data in innovation. We formalize that in this a simple partial equilibrium model. It generates a couple straightforward predictions, and then we test those predictions using data on Chinese facial recognition firms. And so, for to preview what I'll show you very briefly, we generate from our model predictions about the impact of access to government data on firm innovation, not just innovation directed toward products that will be valuable to the state, but also commercial products. And what we find is that after a Chinese facial recognition firm gets a data-rich government contract, firms produce, again, not only more government products, not only more government-oriented software, but also more commercial software. By identifying an elasticity of commercial software or patents to receipt of data, and an elasticity of receipt of government-oriented software to receipt of data, the ratio of those two gives us a lower bound of the non-rivalry parameter of data. And so this gives us sort of a first estimate of this non-rivalry of data between government uses and commercial uses. That's a useful parameter to plug into a macro model that allows us to, sort of speculatively, very speculatively, I'll say, think about the role of the state in three applications. So we think about states that might demand AI for surveillance, and in particular, autocracy and how autocracy perhaps interacts with innovation to shape growth in a data-intensive economy. We think about data regulation and the role of the state in perhaps limiting the collection and sharing of certain types of data. And then we think about industrial policy, which might be sort of explicit industrial policy that is aimed at developing the data-intensive sector, let's say for strategic reasons or economic reasons. And we also think about sort of unintended industrial policy just arising from government collection of data and purchases of AI software. So the outcome of our macroeconomic modeling and some quantitative exercises, which I can tell you a bit more about, although in my 40 minutes, I'll just sort of scratch the surface. The punchline is when the degree of non-rivalry of data is as strong as what we find from our analysis of these Chinese facial recognition AI firms, the state's role as a collector of data and the state's hiring of private firms to process that data can really significantly shape the direction of innovation and growth rate and yield some surprising implications. So just to give a sense of where this fits in the literature. So there's a growing literature on the economics of AI, often emphasizing sort of the transformative possibilities of AI for growth, for labor markets, and for firms. What we add to this literature is really a focus on the state. And we also add sort of a particular element in thinking about data as an input. So people have studied, as I said, non-rivalry of data across firms, but we also think about non-rivalry across uses of data, which we think is important. There's a large literature that kind of fits most directly in this seminar series on industrial policy and quite closely related to that, innovation policies. And there's some good recent reviews of the literature indicating that states can play a role in stimulating certain sectors. And that's true both in terms of looking at industrial output or looking at innovative output. To that literature, so we find another setting where states can play a key role in stimulating output and innovation. But what I think is new is first just looking at this particular sector. We think that looking at the field of AI as this emerging transformative technology is just a very important setting, and it's an area where we think states are likely to be particularly active, and given the role of the state in collecting data, we think states may be particularly effective. We also highlight a very specific mechanism that allows states to shape commercial innovation and productivity, and that is this non-rivalry of data across uses. And finally, one of the interesting things that comes out of the macro model is that we find that sort of unintended industrial policy, in particular, industrial policy that essentially arises from governments just working with private firms, and in so doing sharing data with private firms that can then be used for commercial innovation. That sort of incidental industrial policy is often much, much more cost effective than traditional industrial policy, where the state, let's say, subsidizes the purchase of private data. We contribute to a literature on directed technical change. So that work began as a very theoretical literature. Empirical applications have been somewhat limited. So work has been focused on energy and pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical innovation. Walker Hanlon has a great historical paper that's an exception to that. And we had another sort of industry and another input, in this case, firms innovating. Well, I'll go here for now since I'll finish my thought. Firms innovating in response to the availability of data as an input, which is new. And finally, we contribute to a political economy literature on innovation. So this literature has typically highlighted sort of an autocratic drag or autocratic tax on innovation. Firms ex ante are afraid to invest, fearing ex post expropriation. Elites who feel threatened potentially by enriched innovators might ex ante tax and limit innovation. And sort of, I think a consensus in literature has generally been that autocracy is not good for growth. But we highlight a particular autocratic advantage in our setting, and that arises from autocracy's collection of large amounts of data, potentially autocracy's disregard for privacy, and those two things combined with the non-rivalry of data can generate innovation that's biased toward data-intensive technologies and potentially to more rapid growth. So data-intensive innovation and these key characteristics in a simple partial equilibrium model. So the way we think about this is there's a government software production function. QG is government software. It's produced using government data only, DG. So a key in what we do is we say you need government data to produce government software. And a way to think about that is if you're gonna, we think about the Chinese setting. If you want to predict a human's social score or social risk of committing a crime or an offense using state surveillance cameras, then that's what you do. It's not so easy to find enough private cameras to get rich data to produce the government software you need for surveillance, let's say. In addition, you have a vector of other inputs, XG. In the private sector, and here's where the non-rivalry shows up, private sector software can be produced using either a combination of government data and private data, or you could just produce using private data as well. But to the extent that government data is non-rival, you use your government data, let's say, to produce some government software, but you can also use that government data as an input in producing private software, QP. And the non-rivalry is reflected in the marginal product of government data in private software production. And so the stronger the non-rivalry, the bigger the marginal product of government data in producing commercial or private software. So imagine that firms have a face of demand for both private and government software. Given some amount of government data that's available, the firm will optimally choose how much private data to buy and its inputs of these other vectors. And making some simplifying assumptions gives us a couple very clear predictions and then a useful formula for thinking about the non-rivalry parameter. So the simple predictions are comparative statics with respect to getting access to more government data. So think about this as a change in access to government data. We'll operationalize that by looking at the receipt of contracts with the government, and we'll look at various types of contracts that we think offer access to different amounts of data, but you'll see that in a minute. So what does our very simple model predict? Will change in response to a change in access to government data. Well, a change in DG, delta log DG, should increase delta log QG, so getting access to more government data increases the amount of government software you can produce. It can also, or it is also predicted to increase the private commercial software that you produce. So this one's also going to be positive. Well, I'll just leave it here for now. And it's going to, the change in private software produced is of course going to be a function of this sigma, which is the non-rivalry parameter.
May I interrupt you? We have a question from Dominic Bartelsme. Why are you calling this elasticity non-rivalry? What's the connection between what you consider as a measure of being non-rival and the usual notion?
So, no, I mean, I would say the connection, well, I should have been clear. What we mean by non-rivalry, and this is actually a little clear in the macro model, what we have in mind is when you get government data, you have to use that government data to produce government software. That's how you get government data. So you will be using DG to produce government software QG. That's more explicit when we look at our macro model later, and I'm not even going to get into that much detail, so it's good that I say it now. So private firms get DG, government data, by producing, let's say, AI software for the government. Now, having used that DG, the question is that same DG also useful in producing QP, commercial or private software? And if it's non-rival across uses, then you can use that very same DG to now produce private software, QP. To the extent that it's not non-rival, for whatever reason, it could be regulatory, it could be something about the production function, it might be that the type of data the government collects isn't useful for whatever reason for producing private commercial software. But if it's degraded in some way when you try to move it from one use to another, then that introduces a wedge between how productive that DG is in producing government software versus private. So non-rivalry, we mean essentially the same thing as traditional non-rivalry. The very same data set can be used without any loss. Having used it once to produce government software, can you use it again to produce private software? That's what we have in mind. Okay, so how do you think about non-rivalry empirically? Well, in general, one problem that we have, and you'll see how we address it. I think we address it, about as well as we can, given what's observable in most data sets. The problem is that you don't actually observe how much data firms have. You don't observe how much data firms get access to when working with a particular government agency. So you'll see we have various proxies for access to data, but we don't have a quantitative measure of DG. What's nice about this simple model is that it tells us that we can bound the non-rivalry parameter sigma by looking at the elasticities, the changes in QP and QG in response to exogenous changes in access to government data. That ratio is going to give us a lower bound on this sigma parameter. And so even if we can't observe how much data firms get access to, if we have some sort of exogenous shifter in the access to data, that exogenous shifter in the access to data then changes private software, commercial software production, government software production. The ratio of those two elasticities then gives us a lower bound on non-rivalry. And so that's one of the things that we'll use eventually in our macro data. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about our empirical setting. So just as a reminder, so we're going to think about testing these two comparative statics. What happens when you change access to government data? How does that change your government software production? crucially, how does it change your commercial software production? And then we're going to use those two elasticities to estimate a lower bound on non-rivalry. So why would we do this studying facial recognition in China? Well, we would say, like, this is the prototypical sector in which you should study the role of the state in data-intensive innovation. So if you think about what type of data is it that the state possesses in huge quantities, and any state in general, states possess huge quantities of facial data that can be linked crucially to individual identifiers. There aren't that many other entities. I mean, of course, there are a few notable private ones that have some, but states typically have, among the largest databases of faces matched to names. This is particularly true, I will say, in China. And that sort of data is exactly what you need to train facial recognition software. There's a very precise mechanism that we can also that we can also elucidate in this case that links the state and the state's interest to private sector innovation. So I don't think this is particularly controversial, but I'll just lay it out so you have something in mind. States demand both data and software to monitor their populations. And again, in China, this is very, very clear and well documented. States collect data using surveillance cameras. They contract with AI firms to analyze that data and make predictions. And those private firms that get access to camera data and make predictions for the government can use that same data to train their facial recognition algorithms, which then can be useful facial recognition algorithms in other settings, for example, in retail settings. And that's something that is fairly well documented. It's unclear, how often this happens, whether every firm that contracts with the government is able to do this, but it seems like a very, very common approach that firms take from working with states. So what does that kind of look like? Well, this is an image of what facial recognition software looks like. It collects information from something like a surveillance camera and then matches that information to people.
Now, may I ask a question
Sure.
that came from the audience? Is the provision of government data limited only to firms that have government contracts?
So in this case, yes. And certainly that won't always be the case. So in our model, yes. So in our model, which is maybe a stark assumption, you need to provide services to the state to get access to government data, DG. That's certainly not always true, and then you can imagine many data sets that are made publicly available. But I think there are also many important data sets that have very restricted access, and firms get access precisely by contracting with the government. And in the case of like the sorts of public security contracts that we study, the only way to get access to those data is by working with the state agencies. And you do that when you receive a contract from them. But yeah, that's a great question. And so, I mean, there are other examples of this, outside of China, outside of surveillance. So a famous one in the UK recently is a contract that the UK government and specifically the NHS signed with Amazon to provide AI that would assist in providing health services. And it was quite a well-acknowledged implicit arrangement that produced health services to the UK population. And in return, Amazon obviously got access to an amazing data set that in general firms don't have access to. And the use of that data, of course, will generate predictions and services for the population. So Amazon AI gets applied to the data, and that's great for UK citizens, because Amazon AI makes good predictions. But of course, it's great for Amazon because it's using that data to train its AI and make its AI even better. And it's not signing a contract saying that it will only make those better predictions for the UK population. And of course, we'll take those better predictions elsewhere and extract value from those. those. And at the same time, I'll also say it's clear that in many settings the government does make certain data sets public, and I think that's also acknowledged for sure. Okay, so to conduct our empirical analysis, we basically combine three types of data. First, we collect information on essentially every China-based facial recognition AI firm from Tianyan Cha and PitchBook. And this gives us 5,300 firms, when you adjust for co-ownership. So there are many small firms that kind of are owned ultimately by a mother firm that is larger. So we have about 7,000 subsidiaries, about 5,300 adjusted for co-ownership. And these are, some firms that many of you might have heard of, like Baidu, which has a subsidiary unit that focuses on AI. And then there are firms that really just do facial recognition AI, among others. And one of the key data inputs that we discovered and then and are really just fascinated by in general, and find it super useful for our purposes, is a database of the universe of government procurement contracts over 50,000 RMB that now exists in China. So we collect from that database close to 3 million government contracts. And among those, we specifically identify contracts with public security agencies. So there's going to be our first sort of proxy for a data-rich contract. So we think about a contract with a public security firm as generally giving firms access, with a public security agency giving firms access to larger quantities of data. These are contracts with police and various other units of the government. We find 400,000 or so public security contracts, and again, we're fairly comprehensive and broad in our coding of what might be a public security or surveillance project. We're also able to adjust our definitions as robustness checks. So we also code other sorts of contracts, placebos or sort of comparison contracts. So what we'll show you is essentially event study graphs looking at software development around the time firms receive a public security contract. And then we'll also show you the same sort of event study, allowing you to do like a triple diff essentially, looking at event studies around the time of receipt of a non-public security contract, thinking about those non-public security contracts as giving you access to government connections, giving you a signal of your firm's quality and credibility, maybe giving you access to capital, but not giving you access to very large data sets. And so we retain the other facial recognition AI contracts for use as a comparison group. We find about 28,000 public security contracts with AI firms, and 800 firms have at least one public security related contract. The third type of data that we have is data on firms' output. So another advantage of the Chinese setting, China doesn't always have perfect data, but in this case there's a really nice database on software product releases. We also have data on patents. We focus on products in part because patents show up with lags, and there are some concerns about patent data in China maybe being incomplete. But one nice thing we can do is sort of validate our data, at least for one firm, with a separate source. So Megvii is the first Chinese facial recognition AI, maybe China's first AI firm actually to file an IPO prospectus. So its IPO still hasn't been issued. There are all sorts of interesting stories there, but they issue a prospectus, and the prospectus had 300 important patents. We observe 1,100 patents in our data, and the 302 are a subset. The prospectus indicates 103 software releases, and we observe all of them. So we believe our data are likely to be quite complete, although maybe not perfect. So we categorize our patents and software by the intended customers first. So this is kind of crucial. Our fundamental argument is getting a government contract produces, arguably surprisingly commercially oriented innovation, private sector innovation, not just products for the government. We can code customers in different ways. We start by identifying clearly government-oriented products. And so, one of the key, so just to preview, we eventually use AI or machine learning to predict intended customers, because we can't read every single software product produced. But we predict intended customers, and one of the most predictive words, for example, for the government is traffic. We're able to predict commercial software, again, using machine learning, which of course begins with human coding, just to be clear, training a data set using the human coded data, and building that training data set, and then training our machine learning algorithm, and then eventually using the machine learning algorithm to code a much larger pool of software. So we also have a more general category where we're unable to strongly say, again, even the human coders are unable to strongly say, here's a software product that seems clearly intended for government use or commercial use. We can do different things with this coding, and again, our results are quite robust. So even a fairly strict definition of what it is for something to be a commercial software product generates, to preview our results, very strong responses to government contracts. We also have different functions, and this is something that's just coded kind of independently. So it's not something that's necessarily or by its structure associated with customer. You have different functions of products. So one is within AI. You could have video-based AI, which is sort of the most data demanding type of AI. But then you can also code software that's not AI software, actually. And so we'll focus as our outcome when we think about software innovation. We're thinking about AI software innovation, because that's the data-intensive innovation. But to test sort of a corroborating, prediction of our story is you get access to government data, and that's what allows you to produce more commercial software. Well, if you're getting access to sort of unprecedented amounts of data, it seems very likely that a firm might need to develop data management software, for example. And so we code another type of software as AI complementary. And this would be data storage, data management, data transmission. And so we have that as a separate set of software that we observe firms developing, and we'll look at that as well. So I will skip over this. We use machine learning to code the types of software. Here's our some summary stats. What I can tell you is firms that get government contracts are different from firms that don't. The firms that get government contracts produce much more software. Of course, we'll try our best to account for selection into receiving a government contract. We won't show you anything without firm fixed effect, for example, and I'll tell you more about the empirics in the questions. So I'll just leave it at that. I mean, clearly there's a selection concern. This is our empirical strategy. So as I said, and we can do this in different ways. Just the one fairly transparent way of showing you our data is to show you essentially an event study where these TITs are just time period indicators. And we're going to show you software production, controlling for year fixed effect, controlling for firm fixed effects around the time of receiving a first public security contract. What we need for identification, what would be great is that the timing of the first contract is uncorrelated with any time by firm varying unobservables. That's what we're counting on. And what would be the sorts of threats? Well, of course, if timing is correlated with some sort of firm characteristic that's also correlated with software production, that's going to be a concern. Another type of concern would be that our proxies for data, access to these data-rich contracts, they may also come with other things. So we'll think about both of those. Of course, we'll do the usual thing of looking for differential pre-contract trends to try to address concerns about selection on unobservables. But let me just show you the results. So this is fairly quick because all the pictures kind of look the same. So this is the first software. This is the first public security contract effect on software development of different types. You can see that, by 6 month period. So 6 month by 6 month, getting that first public security contract isn't really associated with differential pre-contract levels or trends of software production, but within a year or so of getting that first public security contract, all types of software increase, and by 4 years after, you have quite a bit more software developed, the most being government, maybe unsurprisingly. Some of that's, of course, mechanical, that's getting the contract. But there's also a very large commercial software response. You can run different types of regressions. In the interest of time, I'll just kind of zoom through. So how do we really pin down the importance of data? So first, comparing public security contracts versus non-public security contracts. And what you can see here is getting police, meaning public security contracts, has a much bigger effect on software over time than non-police, non-public security contracts. So that's suggestive that it's not a contract per se, it's a public security contract. So now, how about looking within the set of public security contracts? So this is something we're working on a little bit more, I must say, but we can code public security contracts as being arguably data richer in places where there are more cameras per capita. And just as a note, cameras per capita aren't highly correlated with GDP per capita, for example. So you have relatively poor places like Xinjiang, which have a lot of cameras. And so what we propose is that getting a public security contract in a high camera place like Xinjiang might be particularly valuable. And that's in fact what you see. So starting from a couple of years after, you see that the high capacity, high surveillance places have bigger public security contract effects than low surveillance places. Finally, you can do these sorts of, I don't know if they're sanity checks or corroborating tests. Is it the case that you see the categories of software increase that you would expect to see increase? So first, do you see AI complementary or data complementary technology and software developed after you get a public security contract? The answer is yes. After you get a public security contract, you don't just get more AI software, you also get more data complementary software. And you also see increases in the most data intensive type of software, which is facial recognition. Just to give you a sense of alternative mechanisms and how we try to rule them out, we try to rule out different types of catch-up stories by controlling for pre-contract output interacted with time period dummies. A rich set of firm characteristics interacted with time period dummies doesn't do much. We're able to differentiate between firms that had high or low capitalization prior to the first contract to test whether the capitalization component of the contract seems important. And we can try to rule out sort of learning by doing. Let me briefly describe the macro model in the next 4 minutes, and thank you for bearing with me. So we essentially write down a model that looks a lot like Asimoglu's model of directed technical change, but now we have 3 goods: private software, government software, and the non-software good. And as I discussed, government software requires government data, while private software can be produced using either both government and private data or just private data. So we actually quantitatively estimate aspects of the model and different exercises. Here I'll just describe those exercises qualitatively for you. We start by thinking about autocracies that demand more surveillance. And this seems, unfortunately consistent with what many autocracies are doing today. You can think about this in a macro model by having, instead of just maximizing the utility of a representative consumer consuming a final consumption good, also having a term that just values the government good itself, which can be surveillance. We note that there is a particular alignment between autocratic states and innovative AI firms. What we find is that in our model, essentially, the demand for more of this government good, the demand for more surveillance, means that more government data gets transferred to private firms. This increases the profits of private firms and that are producing using government data, and that sets in motion biased technical change toward the data-intensive sector and more rapid growth on the balanced growth path. So this is, potentially consistent with what you see in sort of existing facial recognition performance. So Chinese firms are the best in the world in facial recognition, closely followed by Russian firms, and autocracies are actually in the lead. In the lead is a bit of an exaggeration, but autocracies produce surprisingly much AI research. Last couple notes. The regulation of data due to privacy concerns functions in some ways similarly to what we saw with autocratic states. So if you restrict the collection and sharing of data, then that will tend to limit the production of data-intensive technology, tend to bias innovation away from data-intensive technology, and can actually reduce the growth rate when government data in particular is restricted. And again, there's variation across states in norms regarding data collection and sharing. And then finally, just as a note, industrial policy, which takes the form of these sort of unintended government purchases, or perhaps intended government sharing of data with private firms, that actually works quite well. But as I mentioned before, a more traditional subsidy of private sector data alone doesn't work as well. And so what we kind of highlight at the end is that policies such as the GDPR, this data privacy regulation in the EU, or a policy like the social credit system in China could have sort of first order industrial policy components, even though they're not pursued as industrial policy. So the conclusion is these two components of data that we highlight, the role of the state and the non-rivalry across uses, imply that state policy can play a crucial role in shaping the direction and rate of technical change. In China, we find that access to government data indeed stimulates commercial innovation. And one of the interesting sort of outcomes of this is on the political economy side, which is, many people try to explain China's success economically sort of despite its political institutions, but we highlight an element that explains China's success, at least in AI research, as a result of its autocratic institutions, which Martin coined as AI-tocracy. So I like that. I'll leave it at that. Thank you for the extra time, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
So there is a question from David Adler. I'm going to shorten and paraphrase this question. Okay. What about ethics of working with Chinese state data? Can your model handle that? Then there is a question from Christina Orban. If the government does not care about the data being used for other purposes than their government contract, why don't they just sell the data? There is a question from Guido Friebel, who talks about northern countries where the use of large-scale data, for instance, on health, is possible only for domestic universities, which gives them a substantial publication advantage.
Absolutely.
So is there such a race that is a race to the bottom among national regulators with respect to access to data? There is a question from Lothar Grad. Are the government contracts not also a smart way to create a critical mass to develop key competence, to develop an edge in the AI area? Finally, a question from Yucheng Yang. What's the differential implication from state-owned firms and private firms in this process? Let me stop here. You have 7 minutes to answer whatever questions you would like to answer, so please go ahead.
Sure. No, I mean, I appreciate all those questions. So on the ethics of working with Chinese state data, yeah, I mean, one of our slides that I didn't show highlight sort of an American policy. So the American government blacklisted a range of Chinese firms. So in fact, like Megvii, I think, has been blacklisted by the U.S. government because of ethical concerns that these facial recognition firms are supporting repression in Xinjiang. But along with that, the U.S. government made it impossible for American firms to work in Xinjiang. Now, what do we think about that ethically? I think it's absolutely right ethically. Personally, of course, this is a normative statement, but there's certainly an ethical case for not participating in the social control in Xinjiang and blacklisting firms that do participate. But when it comes to innovation, the American firms not participating in Xinjiang because they can't are losing much more, I think, than Chinese firms that are blacklisted in some sense. Certainly on the data access side, the American firms are losing a great deal. So there is definitely a trade-off there. So yeah, I mean, I think that point is right on. So when we think about privacy regulation, one element of that for sure is ethics, and we're thinking a lot about sort of repugnance of data markets and things like that in that component of our analysis. In terms of why doesn't the government sell the data, that's a good question. We don't think about that in our macro model. My sense is the government at some level has of course some constraints on what it can do, and I don't know how sort of likely that is to be observed in the real world, but it's interesting to think about like what is sort of the implicit price of data, and so to some extent that there is some implicit price. The government is demanding these software services and providing in return some amount of data. That amount provided, of course, is a choice that the government makes. It could provide more or less in return for different amounts of services. So to some level, there is some implicit price there. But there's another version, which is, if the government has as its objective function, increasing AI innovation to the maximal extent by providing data more broadly. The government could just provide data publicly and for free. And in our model, providing more government data publicly and for free would surely stimulate innovation on this dimension and stimulate growth on the balanced growth path. In terms of health data and other elements like this, we've thought about this as well. So one of the applications where you also see this is actually in stem cell lines in the U.S., where the University of Wisconsin, sort of for reasons of history and politics, ended up with a particularly important stem cell line after the use of embryonic stem cells was sort of almost shut down by the Bush administration, the W. Bush administration. And that led, I think, to huge scientific rents going to the University of Wisconsin. And I grew up in Madison, so I was kind of aware of this story as it happened. I would say that the same thing, as you say, holds true in the Nordic countries. We see this in economics with the publication of incredibly rich individual level based data from the Nordics. And yeah, I mean, there's an element of like protectionism by retaining access to locals. And I think that is interesting, and I think it is related for sure. So government contracts to sort of coordinate and generate critical competence. I mean, I think there is an element of this. And so, one of the things that I would say is, we're very aware that success in AI is a broader government objective in China. And I think these contracts are one expression of that, conscious industrial policy. So we're kind of saying this is unintended industrial policy. Of course, it's happening in the context where there's also conscious industrial policy. So we're aware of that. And empirically, we can try to account for that in different ways. Time period fixed effects, thinking about different types of controls for the locality where contracts are acquired. We're also working on trying to compile information on all of the more explicit industrial policies at different levels of the Chinese government, so that we can more directly observe this. But yes, I think that there is a role of these contracts as more conscious industrial policy as well. And then finally, state-owned versus private. I think that's a great point. So in many cases in China, as I think many of you are aware, that's a very blurry distinction. So there will be partial ownership by various state entities or involvement by state-supported banks. We know quite a bit about the board members and managers of firms. We know quite a bit about the firm's capitalization. So I think that's worth digging into. I think we can actually sort of code that and either sort of look for heterogeneity depending on connections to the state, or to the extent that we're thinking about controlling for this, we could also do that. So thank you.
So thank you for participating. Many thanks to Noam for being our first speaker, to Mandy from the CEPR for running things behind the scenes. Do not forget to register for next week, and see you then. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.